Wellesley Weston Lifetime Learning offers non-credit courses to seniors in the Greater Boston area. For more information about WWLL and links to our videos, please go to www.llcourses.org.
What a pleasure it is to welcome Gerald Poehner back again to American Issues. Some of you had the pleasure of hearing him before, and you may remember that he is a leading immigration lawyer in New England. He has chaired a number of the professional associations here, and he has lectured frequently on immigration law for the Mass Bar Association. When he came the last time, he talked to us about the basics of the immigration system in the US and some of the problems that have arisen during the present administration. Well, immigration, as we all know, is a subject that has deeply divided this country. People have diametrically different positions, one very negative and one very positive on the economic and cultural impact of immigrants in our society. And in recent months, a lot of this is focused on the fate of the dreamers, the DACA recipients. And what Jerry is going to talk about today is the issues surrounding DACA, surrounding the wall with Mexico, and also the visa lottery. So he brings so much experience to all of these topics, and it's really our pleasure and privilege to have him here today to talk to us. So please welcome our speaker.
Well, thank you very much, Jill, for inviting me again. I think that if many of you would like to just move forward, it would be a little less formal than this group spread out as this, but let's see if we can go forward. I was asked if I would speak first about DACA and then what was called detainers, and in fact there was a case that was just decided last Thursday that I'll touch upon. And then depending upon what we've got for time, we could speak about the visa lottery and the wall. And then I'll be most happy to entertain any questions that you may have. DACA was created by the Obama administration and is known as the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Now the important word there is deferred action. Basically, when somebody comes into the United States, they're entitled to remain here for a particular period of time for a particular purpose. The people that came in under DACA did not have documentation that established those parameters. As a result, anybody in the United States that does not have appropriate documentation and the government is going to detain them as a result of not having proper documentation is subject to deportation. Except the Obama administration decided that they would prioritize the people that the Immigration Service would seek to deport. The first priority would be people who were a danger to the United States, a security danger to the United States. Another group that had high priority were those convicted of serious crimes or multiple misdemeanors. The third group would be people who already had outstanding deportation orders issued by the immigration court. And then the lowest priority were these childhood arrivals that were brought in sometimes with or without parents. Now, in order to have qualified for a childhood arrival status, the DACA status, meaning that the people were not completely exempt from deportation, but it would be the lowest priority on the list of people that the government would seek to deport. In order to do that, a person had to file an application that was good for 2 years and renewable indefinitely for 2-year periods of time. This would give that person the right to stay in the United States during that 2-year period, together with work authorization, and if they wished to travel, they would have to also file an additional petition for travel documentation. The kids had to enter the United States before they were 16 years of age. If they were of younger age, they had to be in school, or they had to have graduated high school, or honorably discharged as a veteran from the armed services of the United States. They could not have been convicted of a felony or an aggravated felony or several misdemeanors. The filing fee, by the way, for each of these applications was $380 plus $85 for fingerprinting, or a total of $495. If they wished to seek a travel authority so they could go out and come back into the United States, there was an additional fee of $575. That's a lot of money when you think about that for all of us, let alone somebody that's just coming into the country. They have to remain and been here for continuous physical presence since June 15, 2007. That's 5 years prior to the issuance of the Obama order that was issued on June 15, 2012. So that means somebody had to have been here 5 years before DACA became effective, and they had to have entered before they were 16 years of age. As we all know, the Trump administration changed the priorities in who they would seek to deport. And today, as a result of the dismissal of the DACA provision, anybody who is undocumented is subject to deportation. Anybody. And what is happening today is, in most instances, the Immigration Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, will be looking for somebody in particular. But if they happen to find somebody in the same household that may be undocumented, may have been here a number of years, may have been working, paying taxes, etc., they will arrest that person and forget about the one that they were actually seeking. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce told us that ending DACA would be a nightmare for the dreamers, but more importantly for businesses and the American economy. So let's talk a little bit about that. I don't want to bore you with a lot of statistics, and I don't expect you to memorize them because I certainly can't. But I think it's important that you understand the contributions of these DACA recipients. There are approximately 800,000 kids that qualify for DACA. The repeal of DACA is estimated to cost the U.S. government $460 billion, that's a B, billion dollars, in the economic output over 10 years. The contribution in state and local taxes across the country is $2.8 billion. They pay $1.4 billion in federal taxes, $2 billion in Social Security, $470 million in Medicare. 24% of the DACA recipients over 25 years of age now own their first home. 5% of them have started businesses which are employing additional people. 8% of them are employing significant number of workers. But let's bring it more local. Let's talk about Massachusetts. There are 7,934 DACA recipients, of which 6,903 are working, contributing to the gross domestic product of Massachusetts of $607 million. They pay $24.3 thousand in local and state taxes. Now, a moment ago I talked about contributions to Social Security and Medicare. Those recipients are highly unlikely ever going to create and receive Social Security. You have to have 40 quarters of employment. They are documented for purposes of employment, but it's highly unlikely the contributions that they make to Social Security will ever be collected by them. What does that mean? It means that the reason that the Social Security system hasn't faltered and failed is because of contributions by foreign nationals that will never be used by them. What are the problems with DACA? Well, as you know, the president indicated that if you bring me a bill, I'll sign it. And then he changed his mind and said, well, I'll sign it if you give me my wall. And it kept on going and going and going until the Speaker of the House finally said, tell us what you want, we'll probably give it to you, and then we can move forward. And he keeps moving the goalpost further and further away. As a result, no legislation has come through. I am told by some of my colleagues who are more familiar with the goings-on in Washington and by those that work at the American Immigration Lawyers Association that there are significant backdoor channels that are being operated by a number of people in the Senate and the House trying to resolve the issue of DACA. They're not getting too far. So at this point, a lawsuit was brought to stop the arrests of the DACA recipients. A court issued an injunction saying that if President Trump wishes to end DACA, he has to follow what's called the Administrative Procedures Act and set forth reasons why he is going to end DACA. And that case is still in the courts. The administration tried to go to the U.S. Supreme Court and ask the Supreme Court to take that case immediately rather than letting it follow its process from the district court to the courts of appeal up to the Supreme Court. And you probably remember a couple of months ago, the Supreme Court said, no, we are going to follow the normal course and go forward first through the appeals court, and then if we decide to take the case, through us in the Supreme Court. So at this point in time, what we have is an injunction prohibiting the end of DACA and letting it go through the courts and determine whether or not the president, first of all, has the authority to terminate DACA and under what terms and conditions. But one of the issues the administration keeps talking about is wishing to reduce the amount of legal immigration here in the United States. So another issue brought before the Trump administration was, well, maybe we'll do something about getting rid of DACA, bringing it back, so long as we get rid of the legal immigration for brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens. That's 50,000 a year. It's going to take a long time to make up 50,000 a year at 800,000 people who have DACA approval. The idea was that by terminating the siblings or the brothers and sisters of the U.S. citizens, it might take about 15 years, maybe 15 years, maybe more, to go forward and legalize all of these DACA recipients. Well, what does that mean? There's no path in most of the legislation that's been proposed to allow these DACA recipients to first of all get a green card and then go forward to U.S. citizenship. Most people get a green card and then have to wait 5 years and then can apply for citizenship. That's the normal course of events. Well, just think about that. We're going to have a group of second-class citizens here that are not going to be eligible to seek U.S. naturalization and become citizens. I don't know that too many people are thrilled with that idea. But let's talk about some of the time constraints that are involved. First of all, it's been estimated that it'll probably take about 2 years to register all of these DACA recipients. That's probably going to take somewhere between 2 and 17 years in reality. Then you've got 2 more years to process the green card application. Then after that, you've got 5 years to qualify for citizenship under current law. And then you've got 2 to 4 years to process the application for U.S. citizenship. So what you're really looking at is about 30 years for this whole process to work its way through the system. I'm not sure that there's going to be very many individuals that are going to qualify for that. The Supreme Court, as I said, declined to expedite the hearing. So what are we left with? We've got 800,000 people that basically are going to have their rights expiring under the 2-year process, and probably more litigation to whether or not those who currently have qualified and received DACA will be able to file another 2-year extension. And I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know what's going to happen. But according to most of the polls that have been taken that I've seen, indicate that 84% of those in the United States favor some kind of relief for DACA recipients. Whether that'll happen or not, I don't know. That, in a really broad brush, is what is going on with DACA. Now, you can understand we've got limited time to talk about some of these issues. I could talk about DACA for probably 2.5 hours, but I don't think that's going to be what you're looking for. And again, in a few minutes, I'll take your questions about DACA. The other thing that everybody is reading about is something called sanctuary cities. Well, the person that was in charge of the Border Patrol was showing the president around the California-Mexican border. And one of the people in the press said, "By the way, Commissioner, what is a sanctuary city?" And his answer was a shrug of the shoulders because there is no definition. He says, "I don't know." Didn't make the president happy, but that's the fact. There is no legal definition of sanctuary city. At one time, back in the Middle Ages, if somebody were being sought by the president, by the king or the high sheriff, he could go into a church or a religious institution and remain there exempt from capture by the king or the Lord High Sheriff. Why? Because the king was ordained and anointed as an agent of the Lord. We all know that there was the divine right of kings. The king didn't want to press that issue with the clergy because back in the Middle Ages, the clergy were among the most powerful group of people going. So somebody would come into the church and could remain here exempt from capture by the Lord High Sheriff or the king's agents. That doesn't exist now. You hear about people who are able to go ahead and go into a church or other religious institution and remain there, and ICE will not go in after them. ICE won't go into a hospital and grab somebody out of the hospital. ICE presumably will not go into schools and pull anybody out of school. They could do so if they wanted to, and if they held a judicially issued warrant, a warrant issued by a judge in a regular federal court proceeding. Now, ICE will admit that when they learn of the existence of a foreign national, they send a letter to the local police department that says, "Look, you've captured Jerry Rovner on a speeding violation. We found out that you've got him because you fingerprinted him. Those fingerprints are automatically sent to the FBI to find out if Jerry Rovner really is Jerry Rovner, because nobody knows. And they automatically go to ICE. So ICE then sends a letter to the Wellesley Police Department and say, "You got Jerry Rovner there. Hold him for 48 hours so we can decide whether we want to come down and get him." In the meantime, I am entitled to a hearing before a bail bondsman to get bailed out of that police department. The moment that I am granted bail and I pay bail, I'm entitled to leave that police department. ICE wants to hold me because they don't know whether I'm legal or not. However, the Supreme Court had a different theory about this several years ago, a lot of years ago. And it said, if I'm entitled to leave that police department and the police department holds me, that's a new arrest. And that new arrest requires probable cause that I committed a crime. By the way, being undocumented is not a crime. It's a civil violation. And the courts have held in many states and federally that there's no right to hold a person for a civil violation under a detainer. ICE itself admits that a detainer is a voluntary request. Okay, sounds good. Now, in the event that the Wellesley Police Department holds me, they now become subject under the Fourth Amendment to an unlawful arrest. And numbers of communities around this country have been sued by people who were entitled to leave but were held by a local police department, and they have won their cases. Now, in the event that the Wellesley Police Department does hold me, the federal government doesn't reimburse the Wellesley Police Department for the expenses of holding me in jail. And it's estimated it costs about $125 a day to hold somebody in court. In jail. And by the way, most of the figures that I'm giving you are not coming from any kind of agencies that are private. Most of the figures I've given you are all coming from the U.S. government figures. So there's nothing here that is one way or the other, pro or con. One of the ICE spokesmen in San Francisco recently resigned because he was fed up with having to give out information that the Home Office in Washington, D.C. wanted that was not completely accurate. Now, if you're going to hold somebody, you should require, and the government is required by U.S. Supreme Court and statute, to get a warrant issued by a judge. This detainer letter just is not sufficient. Now, in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Supreme Court, in a case called Lund versus the Commonwealth, indicated that holding somebody because they are undocumented, again, is a civil violation. It's not a crime, and there's nothing in the Massachusetts statutes that provides authority to hold an individual solely on the basis of a request, the detainer letter, for a civil violation. And they said that if that's what you're going to want to do, you've got to go to the legislature in order to have appropriate legislation created. Which brings me to a very interesting case that was decided last Thursday. Coincidentally, the judge is a Judge Ilana Rovna, who wrote the opinion, and she's no relation to me whatsoever. The Attorney General decided that if a locality is not cooperating with these detainer letters, that was going to be a sanctuary city, and since they were not honoring detainer letters, he was going to withhold appropriated funds under the Justice Assistant Grant, which is really something, because it goes to police departments to help enforce the law. And he was going to have those funds withheld from those communities. Well, somebody had to explain to the Justice Department that we actually have three branches of government. If you remember way back in days of school, we have the executive, we have the judicial, and we have the legislative. Well, the legislative does what? Makes the laws. What does the judicial do? It interprets the laws. And what does the executive do? Enforces the law. They don't make the law. They don't interpret the law. They enforce it. Well, the Attorney General decided to withhold funds from Chicago. And Chicago said, well, we know what the Constitution says. Brought an action in the Federal District Court in Chicago, and the court in the district court issued a nationwide injunction against the federal government withholding any funds from any community because of failure to honor detainers. And the court in Thursday's decision said, the Attorney General cannot withhold funds if a city or locality does not honor detainers. That power alone belongs to Congress. It is Congress that makes the law, not the Attorney General. And unless a provision is in the law allowing withholding of funds, then that becomes unconstitutional and brings into play the 10th Amendment, which says If something is the obligation of the federal government cannot force a state to enforce that. That goes all the way back to the beginnings of the Constitution. Well, I imagine that he's going to appeal that into the Supreme Court, and if cases hold and precedent follows, that will be upheld. That injunction will be upheld, and if you're going to withhold funds, you got to put it in the legislation itself. And this goes back years. I mean, you may remember the Brady bill to enforce some of the anti-gun legislation. And the federal government tried to get New York State to enforce that law while the federal government was trying to gear up to the registration. And this federal court said, no, you can't do that. You've got an obligation to do something as a federal government. It's the federal government that's got to do it. Let's talk about the wall a little bit, because that gets interesting too. Recently, there was a budget that was passed by the US Congress that went into effect probably, 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, that we didn't shut down the government. Instead, they came to a conclusion of the budget. Let's talk about the wall, because it's interesting what happened in the budget. First of all, the US-Mexican border is 1,954 miles long. Previously, Congress has authorized the administration to build a wall that would be 650 miles. Congress voted to reduce the 650 down to 600 miles, and the GAO at that point determined that it would cost about $6.5 million a mile for everything that's already built, and the remainder at about $16 million a mile, and maintenance per year, $275 million. Now, this is law before the budget came through, before Mr. Trump assumed office. Also indicated the Border Patrol would need 30% additional staffing to patrol the wall and maintain the wall. Well, you take a look at what's left. We've got private property that would have to be seized by the government under eminent domain. You have a lot of land on Native American land, and you've got some natural barriers that'd be almost impossible to build on the wall. Now comes the March 2018 budget. It provides $1.6 billion for barriers. That's billion with a B. 251 would be for secondary fencing that already exists in the San Diego area. $445 million for 25 miles of levee fencing. But the most important part of the budget, and I could go on with other details of it, say that you cannot put in barriers that were not already deployed as of March 2017, and it prohibits the construction of any walls that are over basically 40 feet and made out of concrete, which means his wonderful wall is barred by the Congress by the appropriations. And as I just showed you, appropriations have to come from the Congress. They just don't come out of the ethereal atmosphere because an administration wants it. The president wants to build 700 miles of walls, and they estimate there that the cost will be $70 billion. I don't know what's going to happen there. Now, I do want to leave some time for questions. Why don't we take some questions, and if there's any gap in time and you want to hear something about the lottery, we could talk about that as well. Anybody have any questions? Yes. Hang on a minute. I think he wants me to have you put the question into.
My guess is that most people on the street have no clue that DACA recipients are paying Social Security, met all those things. And that's one of the first things that should be widely announced. Why are we not hearing those very, very significant reasons why those people are earning their own keep and contributing to the economy of this country and to Medicare and Social Security.
The question is, why isn't there greater knowledge about the fact that DACA recipients are paying Social Security, Medicare, federal and state taxes, and why isn't that better known across the general population? Well, the fact is there are a lot of different community groups that are trying to get information about that out. One of the things I'm trying to do in the public speaking that I've been doing recently is to try to get this information out. It isn't sexy. It doesn't hit the front pages of things. And there are a number of organizations that are trying to do this and let the people know. I wish I knew the answer, a direct answer to that question, but you really have to search in reading the newspapers and watching some of the television commentary to find a lot of the details of this. And frankly, most of us hear figures like I've given you and our eyes glass over, and we change the channel to watch something like the baseball game because it just doesn't work. I've been a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association probably 30, 35 years, and we've tried to have seminars around a lot of public speaking, writing letters to the editor of local papers. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. Let me go here and I'll be right back.
You mentioned that the court has ruled that DACA cannot be discontinued as President Trump wants it to do. Could you tell me a little more about what in the law allows the court to make that ruling?
The question is, what in the law prohibits the president from terminating DACA? Okay, there is an act that's called the Administrative Procedure Act that sets forth particular requirements before the president or the Congress can change an existing regulation. The court determined through its authority as the interpreter of the law as to exactly what that meant under the terms of the DACA termination. The president, in terminating DACA, instead of coming up with precise reasons to terminate DACA, which in my mind would have worked because it was created by executive order, could probably be terminated by executive order, but they make certain findings in the proposal. He didn't make any of these findings that are required to terminate DACA. For example, there was a parallel law called the Deferred Action for Parents, the DAPA, D-A-P-A, and a case was brought by a number of the governors of southern states indicating a whole series of reasons why that was beyond the authority of the president. And the courts have upheld that termination of DAPA. Now, the president comes along and says, well, I think because the courts have upheld the termination of DAPA, the same thing is going to happen to DACA. That's a general statement that has no basis in precise fact. And he goes on like that. And that's the reason why, so far, the courts have upheld the continued existence of DACA.
Why did Congress give Trump such a small amount in the budget bill when he wanted 20 billion, I believe, and
45.
They gave him 1 billion? Why didn't a Republican Congress give him what he wanted?
One reason, I think, is pure, why did the Congress in the current March budget give the president so small a number of figures than what he wanted? And one is logistics and logic, and that is the Senate has a very, very small margin of Republicans, and 2 votes one way or another could kill the bill and put us into a situation where we would shut down the government, no budget. So my first thought was The only way that the budget would get passed is by compromises on all sides. So they gave the president some money to basically maintain the existing wall and go forward in kind of building some of a wall in areas where it wasn't. The other reason that I think, and I hope, is that most of the Congress is much in favor of maintaining DACA and much in favor of comprehensive immigration reform that goes well beyond the issue of DACA. It goes into how many people should we allow into this country lawfully? How do we handle work employment visas? I mean, right now, if I need to hire somebody, it could take me 5 years to hire a foreign national to come into this country. What about the wages that are paid? The U.S. Department of Labor determines the wages that I must pay to a foreign worker to come into this country. I have to deal with the U.S. Department of Labor, who tells me what the background training experience must be for the person I want to hire. Then I have to deal with the Immigration Service. Then I have to deal with the Department of State. And then I have to deal again. It takes 5 years, and it takes a fortune to do it. So there's a great deal of sympathy on making comprehensive immigration reform a priority in the Congress. But there are enough people in the Congress to hold up any legislation that can go forward. So, and the vast majority of people, I believe, want to see some comprehensive immigration reform for the good and for the bad. There's a lot of things that are wrong with the Immigration Service and the Department of State with regard to this. The only way this is going to happen is with the rest of us constantly sending letters, calling our congressmen and saying, I want you to do something. And eventually it'll happen. So I hope I answered your question, didn't go off on a tangent. Any other questions? Oh, good. Hold on a second.
Specific incidents in Wellesley of the police department holding or not holding supposed
Okay, the issue is whether or not the Wellesley Police Department has held any people under a detainer letter, and the answer to that is I don't know. By the way, when a police department sends out the fingerprints to the FBI to make sure of the identity of the person, it automatically goes to ICE. Now, it also goes to several other federal agencies. Those agencies can send back information to the assuming the Wellesley Police Department, say, hey, listen, that Jerry Rowland has got a wanton warrant outstanding for him in Arizona. The Wellesley Police Department and no other police department is going to release that person because there's a valid reason, a lawful valid reason to hold him. It's not a civil issue of undocumented, it is a legal criminal issue, and most police departments are going to honor that. I live in Needham, and the Needham Police Department recently held a meeting with the community, and they basically are not going to hold anybody on a detainer that is purely a civil matter. But again, if something comes up that there's a felony outstanding or something like that, sure, they're going to hold them. There was somebody way back.
We have the DACA kids. We have those who somehow managed to get in, not legally. So how many people enter our country legally and are able to become citizens every year?
Well, the number of people that enter the country legally, you know, I have a sheet on the number of family-based immigration and employment-based immigration. I believe that the employment-based immigration has 212,000. That would also include their immediate relative, namely the spouse and the kids under 21 years of age would come in at the same time. And I think, I just don't know the answer to that. I could look it up, and if you want to stick around a few minutes, I could give you that answer directly.
I believe the number coming into the country is about 1 million, legally, for one reason or another. And last time I looked at it, the number of family entrances were about 800,000. And 150,000 came through via educational problem.
Well, if they came through under an educational, or they have a master's or a PhD or something like that, they probably came through as part of employment. Again, when somebody wants to hire somebody who is a foreign national, the Department of Labor is going to tell you what his education, background, training has to be, and that would be part of the employment visa. But again, I'm sorry, I just don't know the direct answer to that.
I think I need real basic knowledge of what is the definition of being documented. I always thought that if you were not documented, you couldn't get the kind of a job where you would have to pay Social Security and all those other things. I thought that would preclude you from being able to get a really good job.
The question is, how does somebody get a job if they're undocumented? Well, in the first instance, when somebody comes into the country, there are 600,000 visas that are available for tourists. And the vast majority of those that come in lawfully as a tourist visa tend to stay here, which is amazing to me when you think about that. Now, there are lots of people who just don't want to follow the law because they want to hire individuals for a number of different jobs. And under the law, if a person knowingly hires an undocumented foreign national, they are subject to substantial penalties and fines. And they go ahead and do it anyway. And the prospective employee may bring in false documents, such as a false Social Security card, or some other documents that would be used to establish that individual's right to remain in the U.S. About 5 years ago, maybe a little longer, there was a raid by ICE down in New Bedford at a factory that was making backpacks for the U.S. Army. And when they went in there, they picked up a boatload of people that were undocumented. And the owner of that factory, who was doing work for the U.S. Army making the backpacks, knew that they were undocumented because when somebody would come in to work, and he desperately needed employees, they'd come into work and they'd say, well, I got to see your passport, I got to see your Social Security card, I need to show that you're work authorized. I really don't have, I'll come back and I'll show you my documents, they're back home. And he'd go to his friend and say, by the way, you're working, where did you get documents? And there are some mills that turn out these documents. They're false and phony. The employer comes back and says, well, I'm not a forensic scientist. How do I know that that Social Security card is no good? I mean, nobody has taken a razor and some whiteout and, changed the name from George to Jose. So that's how it happens. I mean, take a look today at the number of people working in the tourist industry in Massachusetts, Vermont, Connecticut for this summer period. A lot of people are going without ability to run their own restaurants. Several years ago, I had a client that had 4 motels down on the Cape. He had to shut one of his motels because he just couldn't get anybody to work. So that's another reason that I allude to when I say that comprehensive immigration reform is really necessary. It's absurd to allow all of these people working without appropriate documents. Some of the employers are good faith people and are willing to pay good wages as they do to everybody else. And others are taking advantage of these individuals and not paying them the wages that they should be paid. It's a problem. We can't take everybody in the United States that we really would like to do. We just can't do it. We need laws and we need restrictions, but those restrictions have got to be more humane and they've got to be more logical to meet the needs of the worker and the family. Can you imagine not being able to bring your brother or sister in to the United States and maybe restrict the number of your children that you could bring into the United States with a green card? Let's assume you go overseas and you meet somebody, and over a period of 2 years, you decide to get married. And now he has a couple of young kids. Don't you think it's logical that those young kids ought to be able to come in as the stepchildren? I think that there are lots of things that require some help. And until we begin to pressure our congressmen and our senators, it isn't going to happen. And the other thing you've got to recognize is, just because it appears that our congressmen and our senators are on the same page as we are on any given issue, doesn't mean you shouldn't write to them. Because when the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe calls the senator's office and says, by the way, how many people are in favor of this DACA renewal in your district? Oh, okay, I get about 300 calls. No kidding. How about those that are opposed? Well, we got 1,240. Because most people who are opposed to something will contact their representatives, but those that are in favor of something that they think their senator is already in favor of don't. So it's just as important, if not more so, that whatever side you're on, pro or con on any legislation, it is required in my mind to become citizens, and citizens is not a spectator sport. And with that, I'll take one more question.
I'm more confused now than I was before, because I don't understand. Are you saying that the DACA people who are paying to for our Social Security, Medicare, they pay taxes, do they have legitimate Social Security cards and documentation? They don't have documentation.
Oh, yes, they do. They paid that $535, and as part of that, they were entitled to work in the United States. And as soon as they were granted DACA status, they went and were entitled, as a matter of law, to get a Social Security card. And therefore, they had work authorization as part of the status of a DACA recipient. Okay? Okay, I want to thank you for your attention. If any of you want to continue this discussion for a few minutes afterwards, come on up. Thank you.